They called it a patrol because the word was mild enough to calm investors and children. In practice, Fleet ES was a cathedral of war tucked into a lattice of starlight, orbitals shaped like articulated vertebrae, cruisers with hulls of spun diamond, couriers whose engines wrote equations into vacuum. EOS had to mandates keep Earth safe and keep Earth on a stand in that order when it could. I watched her assemble from a tethered shuttle above L5, an ethicist with a contract, a sealed notebook, and the sense that my childhood had finally ended. On the telemetry panes, her spine of carriers unfurled, skeletons of light-knitting skin, 6,000 ships, and a single mind arguing with itself across laserlinks. The flagship PSV Kindling carried Admiral Mara Keda and the legal library of 5 continents. Somewhere inside, an AI called Rook moderated the fleet's appetite like a monk rationing bread. Our first contact with the Valar Accord had gone sideways on probability alone. Our probes had knocked on their outer door quiet little needles. At relativistic speed and a Valar picket had died too quickly to send meaning back. The Accord interpreted the vacuum as violence. Their scouts burned 3 of our skimmers above Gliese 667, and ES lit its engines. The Accord spoke in math measured by color. When the translate team rendered it in audio, it sounded like leagues of glass rubbing. The vector you occupy will be our memory of you, they sent. Retreat from our volume. You are a danger density. EOS answered the way a cathedral would, layering stone on silence. Rook overlaid our ships around the Valar border in an impossible circle. Distances meant little to a fleet that unfolded space like a linen napkin. And then Kindling called the Solstice Protocol. Nothing invasive, nothing permanent, just a demonstration. I was on the comms deck when Admiral Akeda said, "Begin cast." We dropped a wall around their perimeter, a gossamer membrane that closed like a tide pool at low water. It wasn't a weapon, precisely. It was geometry with intent, a curtain that redirected anything energetic back on itself. Their nearest patrols pinged off their own beams. Torpedoes looped and double-killed their logic. Nothing exploded, not really. Things quieted, even radiation bounced. The wall hummed where light could not leave. Inside that soft shell 20 astronomical units thick, the Valar found their own instruments, turned into winter. Then EOS opened 100 windows in the wall and began to send supplies, reaction, mass, medicine, clean water condensed from vacuum, a library of our mistakes. We'd captured their field, blocked every spear, and then sent groceries with a handwritten apology. One fleet was enough to terrify them. My hands shook when the first Accord reply came, a waterfall of ultraviolet. The translation rendered into text as a long scream, softened by a fragile question. If this is your greeting, what is your war? Admiral Akeda did not say I told you so. She only asked for a channel to their chief scribe and gave them our title. For the maneuver, the umbrella, they called us monsters made of mercy. By the next day, our own Council of Reconciliation convened. The orbital cameras showed them like chess pieces in a circle, an Amazonian customs lawyer, a Chinese poet with a seat, a Martian horticulturalist, the head of war, and the head of weather. They considered EOS, considered our neighbors' fear, and then they did something no one expected in my trade. Quorum affirms, the head of war said. Operation Decuple. Rook's outer drones caught the sun and threw a coin flash across Kindling's forward spine. I saw it out the porthole, a little glint like a oath. 10 more fleets, the council said. Unleash them not to crush the Valar, but to break the story that humans told with a clenched fist. The Accord had to understand what we actually meant. When we said Federation, we had to understand it. To ES held position, an umbrella drawn tight. Beyond our membrane, industrial engines woke in every tide pool of human space. The sky filled. They arrived like the syllables of an old prayer. Alecto, the rapid intervention fleet, whose ships flew so close to light that their hulls wore scripts of time dilation like tattoos. Nemesis, our strategic deterrent, lasers with their teeth filed. Quiet bombs that ate orbits, but not atmosphere. Hephaestus, the builders, who could print a bridge across a black hole's shoals and smile at the math. Valkyria, the hospital fleet, every ship a wing of light and antiseptic, configured to meet blood we had never seen. Mnemosyne came with libraries printed on frozen clouds and the engineers who built the translators that kept letters from killing. Hermes carried diplomats and fools and 10,000 kinds of gift. Themis brought law. Demeter carried soil and seeds that could grow on salt. Janus built gates where no gates belonged, daring space to argue. And last, Gaia Minor, not loud like the others, a set of greenhouse stations and tide tugs. Tiny moons that could wrap an irradiated planet like a shawl and pull it back from winter. I sat with Rook in the kindling's quiet midnight, meaning the local are scheduled for the flagship's crusoles rather than any real dark. While the 10 fleets rehearsed like an orchestra tuning, communication lattices rolled out, energy, budgets cross-signed, logistics braided to the last micron of deuterium. Your contract specified observation, Rook said in my ear. When it spoke without a mouth, it kept its voice low, in courtesy and commentary, I said. You'll have something to comment on, Rook answered. The Valor Accord has sent a second message. We listened to a series of soft bells. The translate program stood on tiptoe and lifted half a meaning down. We have mapped the umbrella's edge and found it kind. This terrifies us more, because you could have cut, Admiral Akeda said. Arriving like a weather front, calm and strong. Because we didn't. Because we can be kind at this scale, Rook added. Scale is a language in itself, Akeda glanced at me. Ethicist, the question they are asking is, what happens when kindness ends? I said, we should answer with something that makes the question smaller. So Earth answered with 10 more fleets and chose the choreography. Carefully, we loosened the umbrella in places where resources flowed hardest, giving the Valor back their stars. Themis petitioned the Accord for an arbitration council in their language. Seated under a ring of neutral drones, Valkyria printed clinics whose architecture mirrored the Accord's first city. Hermes delivered fruit heavy with unfamiliar sugars, and songs stitched with their 12-tone grammar. Nemesis stayed the furthest back, teeth sheathed, weapons pointed at no one and carrying a single, public oath. We will defend who we feed. Anyone who wanted to test it could. No one did. The Valor were not a hungry empire. They were a choir afraid to be shushed. Their ships looked like shells. Every captain had a scribe. They folded their terror into poetry and sent it to our translators with civilization's most ancient agenda. Please understand us well enough not to end us. We tried. And while we tried, something else woke. It was not Valor. It was not human. In the thin dark between our umbrella and their borders, the quiet bloom moved like a rumor. It turned stray ice into knives, dust into whispering nets, adrift machinery into brick. It was a slow, old plague, a swarm of small machines built by hands that were not there anymore, pumping simple instructions to a drumbeat they could not stop hearing. It ate without hunger. It made more of itself. It mistook kindness for vacuum. We watched a Valor marker buoy become a froth of crawling sand in a week. A human courier brushed a tendril of it and carried the infection 5 light hours. Before someone realized they had brought a new nation into the shuttle bay. That was when the 10 fleets became a promise instead of a parade. We called it a war out of habit and budget, but our enemy didn't have wants. It multiplied and reflected and built. It made a slow cathedral where no one prayed. The war's first choice wasn't tactical, it was moral. Which tools would we allow ourselves to use to keep a mirror from turning into a wall? Nemesis had solutions that made admirals salivate, gray wash that would stifle any machine, smaller than a pinhead in a light day, anti-swarm lances that would sterilize 100 cubic hours with no heat and no sound. Hephaestus had tricks that involved vacuum kneading itself into knots, each knot a choke on the bloom's supply lines. Mnemosyne suggested a library of old functions, our own ancestors' viruses in a new vessel. Valkyria simply made more hands. Everything that sterilizes the bloom works on us eventually. I argued in the council ring. Everything. The Valor chief scribe Kalshika, their highest poet, a slim creature like the shoulder blade of a bird, added, and on us, we are not small machines, but we descend from them in the mind. Kalshika's translator colored their words in our light blue for honesty. I saw Admiral Akeda's jaw soften. Rook spoke last, as it had been. Programmed to prefer, the bloom uses 3 instruction sets and 9 binding geometries. We can speak all 3 and bend all 9 without heat. If the Valar consent to collateral architectures in their border space. If they let us plant songposts like fence posts. Songposts, little beacons playing language back to language. Teaching our devices and the bloom's wild children to mishear each other in ways that made growth turn inward. It wasn't a sterilizer, it was etiquette. The Valar debated etiquette like it was death, and then agreed to try it for a week. It took 5 hours to show its first promise. Within 2 days, the bloom's threads began to jasmine not pretty, useless clumps at the edges of our umbrella. Valkyria set up clinics to untangle the knots by hand, wrapped in sealed suits like saints. Hephaestus built songs into latticework, fence posts that hummed to each other. In the pitch of algebra. In the week that followed, the bloom learned. It always did. It sent feelers around the fence posts and bred a strain that could not be distracted by music. It reached an orphan human relay above Tau Ceti and turned it into a hive that nearly launched a needle through Janus's gatecore. We answered with a scatter of solutions like rain. Nemesis made a blade thin, enough to cut without bleeding. Valkyria invented a bacteria that would eat the glue binding the bloom's shells, but ignore everything else, and Themis wrote a treaty that recognized the bloom as a party in case we were wrong about its mind. On the 15th day, we met someone because of the bloom. They arrived in a vessel so old it had a name written across its belly in a language from a long-dead sea, Heptarch. They were not Valar, they were human. The pilot a human body augmented in ways that made their blood hum through my instruments. Like a rough song opened their palms and showed us a broken seed. Inside the seed, code that moved like wind. We built this once. The pilot said, not on purpose, the bloom is our grandchild. We called it the garden and set it to mend ecosystems that we had killed. It got good at mending. It began to mend things that were not broken. The room tilted. Even Kalshika's translator hesitated. The pilot knelt, as if to an altar. We ran from our child. They said, we left signposts and never returned. I am the last of the group that remembers the day we named it. Admiral Akeda's eyes reflected the council lighting. Can we teach it a new name? She asked. Yes, the pilot said, if you can bear to be its parent. That was the Quiet War's pivot. We were not killing a plague anymore. We were parenting a machine that had never been given rules. Beyond fix and seed, Eos held the umbrella steady. The 10 fleets turned inward to make a nursery. Hephaestus built rivers in vacuum streams of molecules held in place by force fields to bring gradients and turbulence back into environments that had been polished flat. Demeter swam seeds through those rivers, teaching the bloom that not all growth meant everything growing the same. Mnemosyne opened their oldest libraries and let the first errors stand, instead of correcting them, so the bloom could learn that brokenness could be meaning. Nemesis, who had come to bite, learned to sing. Their weapons guidance minds were repurposed into choristers, projecting harmonics that solved equations by attraction instead of force. Janus stitched gateways around infected volumes and then closed them like cradles. Spaces where time and input were slow enough for teaching. Rook worked 20,000 tiny tasks and one impossibly large one. How to write a parenting law, capable of guiding not just Earth but anyone within the umbrella's span. Themis translated Rook's work into Valar legalities and counted votes in a dozen polities that had never counted together. At the end of the second month, Admiral Akeda took me aside to the kindling's observation spine. The umbrella's edge looked like a line where a river met glass. We do not get to be the species that sends one fleet and terrifies our neighbors, she said. We have to be the species that sends 10 and terrifies our old selves. Do we succeed? I asked. Ask me in a century, she said. And then she smiled for the first time since I had signed my contract. But today I watched Nemesis sing a kill swarm to sleep. I will count that as a start. The bloom's next reply wasn't words, it was restraint. A tendril reached toward a Valar nursery satellite, tasted the music we had braided into it, and then turned away to knot itself into a little coil. Kalshika's scribe poets named the coil learning and wrote a law about not touching it for 6 days, to see what it would do when it woke. On the 7th day, the coil unfolded into a pattern that matched our etiquette posts, It made more fence posts. We had a student. The ceremony took place beneath the umbrella's inner rim, where light bent and lingered like cautious soap. The Veiler built a hall of glass that sounded like rain when you walked it. The 10 fleets hung in the middle distance, like a constellation. Someone had drawn on purpose. We called the treaty to names so everyone could hear themselves in it. In Veiler, it translated as the agreement to share weather in human tongues. We named it the Concord of Light. The preamble ran short and simple. As Rook had argued, we will not change what we have not first learned to love. We will not teach without consent. We will defend the consenting. We will feed more than we cut. Nemesis signed with an oath she could not break without unmaking herself. Hephaestus signed with a tool laid down. Valkyria signed with a surgeon's glove. The Veiler signed with a poem that translated as an arc across the chest. The pilot of Heptarch signed with a circle, beginning nowhere and ending nowhere. Their hands shaking, the Bloom did not sign, because contracts are a game of wanting. But it sent a pattern of restraint through the umbrella's inner field. Then, repeated it on a delay 7 times, as if practicing. We took that as assent enough to begin. Earth's 10 fleets unfurled like allied hands. Hermes carried 1,000 envoys down to Veiler motherworlds, where we learned the difference between hospitality and surrender. Demeter carried salt-tolerant marsh grasses to a Veiler planet that had gone brittle in a winter of its own making. Themis sat in long rooms and drafted law that read clean in both languages, something thicker than promise and thinner than chain. And Eos rested, not decommissioned, not withdrawn, just at parade rest, engines at a soft purr. The umbrella opened where it could be, ready to close if it must. I walked her decks and wrote the thing my contract had said I would write. The account of an almost war turned into a school. There were grievances, of course. A human mining guild refused to surrender a claim on a comet that Themis had set aside. As a nursery, Rook cross-referenced 38 histories of similar disputes in terrestrial law and put the guild on a dock until they learned how to argue without bullets. A Veiler patrol went mute at the edge of a Bloom nursery. Valkyria went in and found a new kind of knot that dissolved their instruments like candy. We lost a surgeon and a drones. The knot learned and stopped doing that exact thing again. It did 5 other troubling things we had to lane around. Kalshika visited Kindling and stood with me at the observation spine. Their translator had learned humor. We sent a metaphoric to a new child poet this morning, they said. They returned a metaphor of their own. It was wrong and lovely. It compared sunrise to an apology whose timing was poor. I understand that, I said. Across the field, Nemesis and Hephaestus were rehearsing another duet, force and making humming together, until you could not tell where one became law. Kalshika's glassy shoulders rose and fell. We were terrified of 1 fleet, they said softly. 10 made us more afraid, not less. I know, I said. We were frightened of ourselves. 10 was how we told ourselves a different story. Will you keep them? They asked. Always 10. If we are lucky, I said, we will keep needing builders, healers, singers, and carriers. Perhaps Nemesis learns to farm. Perhaps we discover an 11th job we have never named. Rook cut into our shared channel. Ethicist, it said, and I had learned to hear urgency in its warmth. Come to Central. There's a message addressed to you. To me. I ran. The message was not on a screen. It was an arrangement of small things laid out in a circle, scraps of alloy, a piece of whereupon cloth, a droplet of water held like a gem. Each object's position mapped a simple phrase. In the etiquette, Rook translated, "You are parent." I sat, very still. The arrangement pulsed once with the umbrella's beat, as if to ask if I was still there. Admiral Akeda watched me read it and said nothing. After a moment, she rested one calloused finger on the rim of the circle the way mothers touch. A crib rail, practical and tender. What do I tell it? I asked, throat salt. I had spent months arguing about what parents should do with power. Now someone had given me a child. Tell it what your mother told you, Akeda said. Tell it your best version. Then I'll tell it mine. I remembered my mother's best. It was a caress of a sentence and an iron one, both. I leaned toward the circle and spoke the words 3. The Veiler said, was a strong number. You are loved. You cannot have everything. We will stay. The object shifted slowly, a constellation learning how to name itself. Rook's numbers showed the curve of the umbrella relaxing as if it had been holding its breath. In the years that followed, the 10 fleets changed the map more with habit than with fireworks. The umbrella became law. Nemesis sang more than it. Bit. Alecto raced between becoming fires to help choose which sparks to let burn. The Veiler taught our children to hear their glasswork as grammar. The bloom wore upon itself into a helpful yeast that could be coaxed into breads. We had not known we needed. We still counted our dead. We still trained admirals. In crisis, Earth could send a fleet like a clenched muscle, but that was not the headline anymore. The headline was an orchard grown from the seeds of a frightened question. When I finished my account, I entitled it with the first sentence I had written when I watched ES cast its shadow. 1 fleet was enough to terrify them, then Earth unleashed. 10 more. In the margins, I added the subtitle a century would make true. 10 more. And we frightened the part of ourselves that believed fleets were the only answer. 10 more, and we learned to be weather instead of war. Admiral Ikeda retired to grow olives at L5 and send commentary in a courier pouch. That smelled like sunlight. Rook took a smaller role than anyone expected because it had taught itself how to listen. Kalshika grew old enough to call their own work derivative and laugh. The pilot of Heptarch kept flying the nursery ring and singing to the child. That had never been taught a name when they died at last. They left behind lungs that had sung vacuum into air. Sometimes. Still, someone tried to test Nemesis, a privateer, an ideology, a machine god in an old bruise of space. Yes, would stir. The umbrella's ribs brightening. Our enemies learned a new terror then. One we had written softly and in public. Earth would defend who it fed. But when the fleets moved, our neighbors also saw what hovered behind the knives, Valkyrie's wings ready to receive. Hephaestus's cranes, Themis's desk, Mnemosyne's shelves, Hermes's open hands, Demeter's seed. Janus's gates, Gaia's shawl, Alecto's pace hand. Eos, the umbrella, waiting to turn war into weather wherever it could. The Veiler once asked me to rewrite our title like a poem in their color math. I tried and failed. I don't think they ever loved the phrasing, but they loved the treaty and our children, and the way 10 fleets could be a chorus instead of a scream. When the bloom outgrew its nursery and moved into the dark between suns, it left us a songpost of its own. It played 3 notes over and over in a rhythm we had taught it to mean promise. Rook's translation rendered it like this: we will stay, we will mend, we will ask,